So thank you both very much for taking time to do this. We try at Sapir to really engage in serious conversations. The subtitle of our publication is Ideas for a Thriving Jewish Future. And one of the convictions that we brought with the creation of this publication is that we wanted to have conversations that included a wide range of Jewish thinkers, ideologically, religiously, and in other ways. And I think this conversation really showcases it. Both of you are distinguished contributors to our 9th volume, which I have here, if you can see it. That's Israel at 75. Yes, it really is a real publication with many pages. And both of you had really superb essays that spoke not just to 75 years of Israel, but Israel at the moment. So Avi, I've known you for many years, from the days I was editor of the Jerusalem Post. You're a professor of law, both at Bar-Ilan University and the University of San Diego, and a graduate, I should add, of the University of Chicago, which is— Proudly so. Which is the most important credential of all. Jesse Ferris, Vice President of the Israel Democracy Institute, where I have the privilege of being a member of the International Advisory Board, and the author most recently of a book on how Israel can survive in a nuclear Middle East, should it come to that, although that seems more and more likely. But we're here to talk about the question of judicial reform. And Avi, I'd like to start with you. I was particularly proud to publish your essay, because when you hear conversations, at least in English language media, about the judicial reform, it's 99% against, making the case that the reform is incipient fascism, at least a profound danger to Israeli democracy. And I thought it was exceptionally important to have the best voice I could find to make the case that, in fact, the reform is in many ways overdue and a reflection of democracy, not a contradiction or a threat to democracy. So just to start us off, and one more point to our audience, we'll have this conversation for about 35 minutes and then turn it over to audience questions. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. As questions occur to you in the audience, put them in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to as many as I can, favoring the harder questions, not the softballs. So, but Avi, just in brief, give us an overview of the case for the reform and why so many of us, I have to say, including me, might be getting this story completely wrong in terms of our views of what the reform involves and what it might portend.
So the basics of the reform is really a battle between the two different constitutional legal models that Israel's had over the years. The original traditional one was one of parliamentary democracy in the style of the UK. And what we have today, as a result of a series of changes that was made by Aaron Barak, a justice on the Supreme Court, that he frankly called a revolution. As a result of those changes, we have something else. I would call it some sort of form of platonic guardianship over democratic forms, or one-party democracy, one institution democracy, where everything is ruled ultimately by the judges who institute their own policy preferences. Now, it's not that impossible to think of a platonic guardianship as being a viable system, and I understand that the anti-reformists believe that the true democracy is not one in which the people decide, but in which an elect decides in favor of them, over them, on the basis of the values that it selects. but that I think is an inferior system to actual parliamentary democracy, which Israel used to have, and the judicial reforms intended to restore. And the real thing that's bothersome about this debate, this is not a new debate. The question about whether Israel should restore its parliamentary democracy or keep the revolution that was wrought by Justice Aaron Barak is a debate that goes back 30-something years, since the days when Barak carried out his revolution. And it used to be that there were, it was fairly well divided. Critics on the left, critics on the right of Barak called for a return to the traditional democratic system instead of this sort of judicial aristocracy that Barak created. But in the modern moment, we're so politically polarized that everyone has abandoned their previous positions if they're in the wrong camp. So all of the left-wing supporters of judicial reform have disappeared or gone underground. All of the right-wing supporters of the judicial aristocracy have gone underground. And we're left with this highly polarized debate, frankly, dishonest debate, in which the champions of Platonic guardianship are describing themselves as the two true Democrats. They're describing the proponents of parliamentary democracy as dictators. And they're insisting that one-sided governance by an institution that favors one side of the political debate over the other, that favors rights when they're protecting their people and disfavors rights when they protect the other people. They describe that as liberal government. And I think that's very unfortunate. It's even more unfortunate that the tactics that are used to intimidate people of my opinion. I get death threats all the time. This is new to me, and it would be wonderful if we could return to a reasoned debate about this.
Let me ask you on this very point, because one of the things that's up for debate in this discussion is the meaning of the term democracy. And Jesse, in your essay, you quote the president of the Supreme Court, or at least she's a justice, Esther Hayut, saying democracy doesn't simply mean, let me get the exact quote. She says, democracy means freedom. A government supported by a majority can also negate freedom. And in a place in which guarantees for individual freedom do not exist, democracy does not exist. Take us through the argument, the contrary argument to the one that Avi just made, because for many opponents of this reform, and many of them are people who used to be on the right, they see this as a bid to, number one, consolidate and personalize Bibi's Prime Minister Netanyahu's rule, and secondly, to remove the only meaningful countervailing force in Israeli politics. In the United States, we have checks and balances, Congress versus the executive versus the judiciary. Israel parliamentary democracy has few checks against the will of parliament, and the will of parliament is usually the will of the prime minister and his ruling coalition. So give us the opposite view of what Avi just offered.
Sure. So first, I'd like to say that I would dispute the characterization of opponents of the judicial reform package as anti-reform, at least in so much as it pertains to me personally and to many of my colleagues at the Israel Democracy Institute. In fact, we've been in the business of reform, including reform in this area, constitutional reform and judicial reform for decades. And unfortunately, there haven't been many takers. It hasn't been an issue with a lot of market demand. Now there is an awakening, and maybe there's an opportunity, but obviously there's also a tremendous crisis. And I think that before addressing the shortcomings of the reform package, I also want to say that I was very intrigued by Avi, both in his remarks now and in his written presentation in Sapir, his depiction of Israeli history, sort of pivoting around this revolution orchestrated by Barak when he became president of the Supreme Court in the mid-90s. as a historian, I was intrigued by that. I reflected on it somewhat, and ultimately I find it unconvincing. I mean, this depiction, both the choice of the watershed moment, the depiction of the pre-watershed moment as some idealized form of parliamentary democracy, and then this sort of juristocracy that was established on the ruins of the old liberal regime. I mean, in terms of this, may be quibbling, but if Aaron Barak were present in this conversation, he would say it's not 1995 when I joined the court. It's actually 1992 when the Knesset, using its constitutional powers, passed the basic law of freedom and human dignity, which had a limiting clause, and that gave us, the court, the power to strike down laws that were in contradiction with that basic law. And that definitely was an evolution, but it originated in a legislative act and not in the court. Of course, 1995 was also, we have to say, particularly significant because of the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin by a Jewish extremist. So that's, you know, if I had to pick a point that was sort of a watershed moment, I would gravitate towards 1977, Likud's rise to power, the true first peaceful transition of power in Israeli history, the move from a Mapai-dominated system to a two-party system. Unfortunately, now it's a very multi-party system, but that may be a separate argument. In terms of the history, I think Avi would be the first to concede that the history, Israel has a very strong tradition of very assertive judicial power, both from the court and also in terms of the legal advisors, which are also the center of this debate today. The famous court from 1953, back in the days when Ben-Gurion ruled with an iron fist, the Israeli Arab citizens were still under military rule, and Menachem Begin was wilting in the opposition, seemingly forever. A judge struck down a decision to shut down a communist newspaper on the grounds of free speech, which is nowhere in the Declaration of Independence, certainly not in the basic laws at the time or since. And so you have this assertion of judicial power way back then. Fast forward to 1976, when a young rising star attorney general by the name of Aaron Barak basically forces Prime Minister Rabin to resign over a leftover bank account containing some thousands of dollars left over from Rabin's term as ambassador in the U.S., which was at the time a violation of Israel's currency regulations. And so this is the pre-1995 reality is one. I don't think one could say that the judiciary was sort of put in its box. And then in terms of the post 1995 reality, there's no question that Barak was a brilliant and innovative, strong-willed justice, and he left his mark on the court and on successive generations of jurists to this day. But this depiction of a sort of a juristocracy as you depict it seems somewhat overwrought. I'm hard pressed to think of any major policy initiative pursued by the governments of the last 30 years that was thwarted by an overpowerful judiciary. Of course, we have to remember Alexander Hamilton famously reminded us in the Federalist 78 that the judiciary is by definition the weakest of the three branches of the government. It can pose no danger to liberty on its own, and it is completely dependent on the other two branches of government. It must be protected from ganging up by them, which seems to be what is going on at the moment. But I mean, you think about it: the Oslo process, the disengagement from Gaza, the establishment of fences or walls on our eastern and southern borders, the destruction of the Syrian nuclear reactor, war with Lebanon, Operation Defensive Shield, countless operations in Gaza, hundreds of Palestinian militants dead in targeted assassinations, not to mention Iranian nuclear scientists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard to see that the justices are sort of standing athwart governments and prime ministers from Ariel Sharon to Bibi Netanyahu and kind of calling the shots in Israel. So I think that this depiction of reality, which is sort of the basis for the urgent need for reform of the judiciary, is somewhat skewed.
So let me press this point and return to Avi. What are, to you, the salient examples of a juristocracy overriding the principle acts of government, the will of the majority in cases that are genuinely significant to Israeli social and political life.
Before I give you the example, let me just say something. I don't mean to be too modest here, but you can't present this idea of the juristocracy or the judiciary taking a new role, a new powerful role during the Barak era as an invention of Avi Bell. It's something that was remarked on back at the time. And this is basic in every law school today. You'll study an essay by Manny Mountner, a prominent left liberal professor, now emeritus at Tel Aviv University, where he describes the changes that Barak made in the system, that he transformed it from a system of formalist legal rulings to one of values, which are euphemisms for moving on from the rule of law to policy making by the court. And this is not, again, this is not an invention of mine. This is fairly uncontroversial, and it was recognized also on not simply by opponents on the right, opponents on the left, and by supporters on the left. Supporters like Eli Salzberger, used to be dean in Haifa, described the court as moving from the activist court that it was during the 50s, during the Kol Ha'am decision, to a hyperactivist court. So what does this hyperactivist court do? The hyperactivist court has a clear political leaning. So it was not going to block Oslo, and it was not going to block the withdrawal from Gaza. But you do have the court that was not willing to allow shutting down the communist newspaper, the Stalinist newspaper, Kol Ha'am in 1953. It did not only allow, but ordered the shutting down of Arutz Sheva, a right-wing radio station that had received license to broadcast directly from the Knesset because of a dispute about whether it was broadcasting in territorial waters of Israel. And the court struck down the law. It struck down the law on the grounds that there's a limited number of radio frequencies in Israel, and the day may come at the end of time when someone else will want that frequency and was unfairly given to Arutz Sheva. Now, this is pretty strong policy making of what to me seems unjustifiable. The court hasn't worried so much about to avoid control of the purse, avoid control of the sword. It's created taxes. It struck down taxes. Its order is to found a constitutional right to receive welfare benefits that was violated when there was means testing in the form of fewer benefits if you own a car. But then it found that it's not a constitutional right when it comes to giving subsidies to yeshiva students, to the ultra-Orthodox. And you have a fairly clear line of cases like this. I actually taught a course once, it was just matching up pairs of the court defending the rights of some and denying the rights of others. And it's according to a fairly clear pattern of, I wouldn't say it's partisanship, because it's clearly not partisanship, but it's the ideological entity, the ideological identity of certain parties. The court, it defends some kinds of minorities, let's say LGBT, right? And it really does not defend. It actually goes after certain other minorities, primarily the ultra-Orthodox. And it takes control of policy in some cases long before it even gets to the parliament. So if you want an example of the court exercising control over defense decisions, the way the court has done this is by delegation. So one of the most controversial decisions of Barak's court was to change the power of the attorney general from a lawyer and legal advisor to a legal overlord, one whose decisions are binding. So it was reported about 10 years ago, Netanyahu ordered the chief of staff to engage in preparations for a potential attack on Iran's nuclear program. And the chief of staff said, no, I have to check with the attorney general first. Now, this to me is just shocking. And I don't understand how you can operate the defense of the country where the elected government can't make these kinds of critical decisions. Instead, the decisions get made by the Attorney General as the messenger of the Supreme Court.
Let me ask you, Jesse, when I speak to a lot of Israelis who I don't consider, really in the middle and the mainstream of the conversation, who are opposed to this reform, they will tell you sotto voce, some reform of the court makes a certain amount of sense. And we have been, and Avi referred to this in his earlier remarks, this thought has been on our mind for some time, that the court does in fact overstep, that its role is not well defined, that it is completely within the four corners of any rational democracy to try to define the correct ambit of the various major institutions of government. What they will then say is it's not so much the reform itself, it's who's doing it, for whose sake, and why now. That's what I hear. So two questions, I guess. Number one is some kind of reform, whether it's the one that the Knesset was considering or not, is some kind of reform necessary? And how would a good reform differ from what the Knesset had been or may be considered?
So obviously no system is perfect, and the judiciary is no exception to that. And there's a lot that needs to be fixed. Arguably it lies in other places than the places that were singled out by Avi. Right now, the whole country is in this extended political paralysis because the trial of one man has gone on for 3.5 years. And unfortunately, what he's going through is what a lot of Israeli citizens are going through: very lengthy court proceedings, in part because of underfunding and limited numbers of justice and the structure of the system. I'm no legal expert, but there are structural remedies to alleviate the pressure on the courts. I mean, it's also no secret that the U.S. Supreme Court sees 80 cases a year, reviews 80 cases a year. In Israel, it's close to 10,000. And so there's an overload problem. And there are other issues too with the Attorney General and with other parts of the system. The problem is this sort of pile on by two branches of government on a third, without looking at the problem holistically. And the point of departure is, I think, especially for Americans who are listening, that Israel is not the United States. And I make this point frequently, regardless of the constitutional issue. I mean, we do not inhabit a continent. We're not flanked by two oceans. We don't have Canada and Mexico as neighbors. We have very little margin for error. But the same is true of our constitutional makeup. I mean, the whole country, its national defense is, as I say in the piece, is based on the willingness of a mobilized citizenry to stand up against multiple enemies. We're still under existential threat. And we're doing this, unfortunately, in a constitutional context that is very fragile. Ben-Gurion was a man of many virtues. Our founding fathers did great things to set us up. The one area where they left us a deficient legacy was in terms of our constitutional makeup. The Knesset convened as a constitutional body in early 1949 and then promptly disbanded, having failed at the basic task of formulating a constitution with a Bill of Rights and a clear definition of the relations among the three branches of government. And in a way, this whole crisis is an outcome, a long belated outcome. Up till now, for 75 years, we've sort of managed to get by one way or another. But this crisis is a reminder that we have unfinished business in the constitutional realm, and the problems are not limited to the judiciary. Yes, there's what to be done there, but it's a question primarily with the relationship, redefining the relationship between the Knesset and the Supreme Court. And in this context, yes, defining the scope of judicial review, it may need to be curtailed somewhat, but also defining the very act of constitutional legislation. I mean, physician, heal thyself. The Knesset has amended basic laws 27 times in the last 5 years, abusing their constitutional powers, the fact that they continue to wear these two hats as normal legislature and as constitutional assembly, just to meet political needs. And this is not a partisan point. I mean, we created this two-headed monster regime just so that Gantz and Bibi could share the premiership. And we had to change basic laws to do that. And we're doing it again and again and again. It's because of the very fragility of our system. We do not have defined rules of the game. And it's intolerably easy to change the fundamentals of the regime, as I would argue is being done now, and also to mount serious threats to individual liberties in the absence of a constitution with guaranteed principles. So what we really need is a new constitutional arrangement that would primarily define the rules of the game and entrench our basic rights. And that's what a true reform would look like. And it would be comprehensive, and it would look at all three branches of government and address the imbalanced relations among them.
Avi, do you agree with that? Does Israel need a constitution?
I think that a constitution, a written constitution, would be a very good development, but of course it would depend on what was the content of that constitution. But I think that it really is question begging to put the question that way, because that's not what we're arguing about right now. I don't believe that there is today a wide enough consensus in the Israeli public to be able to make a constitution. The question is, what should be the fate of the constitutional amendments that were made by the Barak court during the 90s and the 2000s, that were made unilaterally by the court without consulting anyone, that were extremely controversial. You know, Jesse mentions this idea that the Knesset had been wearing all along secretly, besides being a parliament, it had also been a constitutional assembly that would pass pieces of the constitution from time to time that would have constitutional force. Now that was Barak's theory. That was the excuse that he used in the middle 1990s for what he called the constitutional revolution. But it was not accepted by most people. It was highly controversial. The majority of his faculty members in the Hebrew University at the time disagreed with him. Certainly most of the rest of the public, but he did it anyway, and he could because he had functional control of the Supreme Court, not only because of he was the deputy president about to become the president, but also because he'd already played a significant role in taking over functionally appointments to the court. And so I think that the question is not, wouldn't we be better off with a written constitution? Yeah, we almost certainly would. Wouldn't it be better if we had written, clearly defined roles for the different branches of government? Yeah, almost certainly we would. By the way, would we be better not having a British-style parliamentary supremacy, but instead having an American-style system with a strong president, with federalism, with two houses of parliament? Yeah, we very well might be. Although on this, I'm a little bit more skeptical. I'm conservative here. I'd rather stick to what we know before we jump into new forms. But the debate about constitutional reform is not a debate about creating a new constitutional structure. It's a debate about the revolution that no one asked us about, the revolution that Barak carried out that fundamentally changed Israel's constitution from the parliamentary democracy that we used to be into the juristocracy that he created. And I think that juristocracy has been a disaster. And I think that it's part of the reason for the political paralysis that we've seen over the years. And they are clearly related. So for example, when you if you asked Mautner back then in the 80s and 90s to explain why it was that the court had carried out its shift from formalism to values, as he put it, from the rule of law to policymaker, and the answer, he gave the answer. It was that his party, the Labor Party, had lost, and the great unwashed, the Likud, had come into power. And this was leeching the power out of the democratically elected institutions to put in the hands of a better class of people. And I think that returning to our democracy, before we get even to the big constitutional questions, what we to draft a constitution, I think that is the most important thing that we can do. And by the way, the IDI was involved with a big effort to draft a constitution. I remember I was invited at the time to give my opinions on not on the bigger questions, but on the smaller ones, such as property rights. And I wasn't a particular fan of their constitution. It's not that I was opposed to drafting a constitution. It was that I think that the particular constitution that they drafted was one that was overly jurisdicratic and insufficiently democratic.
Jesse, I know I saw you kind of raise a finger to address something Avi wants to say. So I want you to get that point in, but I also want you to talk about something that Avi mentioned, and in fact, it's the heart of your essay, Israel is Dangerously Polarized, which is that the debate we're having now about the particular institutional arrangements between the judiciary and the Knesset is in some ways a stalking horse for a larger set of questions about the demographic and even, if you will, ideological makeup of Israeli society. I don't want to characterize it as Ashkenazi versus Sephardic because that's, I think, much too crude and doesn't really capture what's happening. But there's no doubt that when you saw these enormous protests in Israel, culminating with the protest over Galant's firing, that you had a sense that this was liberal Tel Avivian, if you will, Israel, fighting for what it saw as its diminishing but still powerful place in Israeli society. That there something was much larger at work than the question about the reform, which is what class of people hold power. And in that sense, it goes back to 1977 and the collapse of Mapai and the collapse of that sort of order in and social order in Israeli life. So you had this point you want to make. I want to let you make it, but I would like you to address this larger question about what's happening to Israeli society that this reform seems to have brought to the surface.
And all of this in the next 3 hours?
I expect concision from my guests.
Just telegraphically, first, I wouldn't give up on the hope for a constitution. I think if there's a silver lining to this moment, it's the incredible awakening on all sides of the issue among the Israeli public. Again, when Avi described our constitutional effort at IDI 20 years ago, frankly, there were no buyers. Today, there are. According to our polls, two-thirds of the Israeli public would support a constitution based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. I think that's something we can build on. Number two, in terms of Likud and the great unwashed and the changing of the elites, I just point out that Menachem Begin's favorite jurist was one Aaron Barak, and Begin was a staunch defender of the independence of the judiciary, which he felt was sort of the last bastion of defense against a temporary political majority, which at that point was aligned against him, cracking down on individual liberty. In terms of this diagnosis of, this is also was very much central to Levin's, the justice minister's speech, that the source of our woes are you elect us time and again, and yet we're powerless to govern, and it's because of these 10-foot tall jurists who lord over us. I think it's disingenuous, and if you look deeper, I mentioned the broader context of Israel's constitutional problems, which require a wider lens. But I think ultimately it comes back to another issue that we've been trying to tackle for the past 20-some years. It's the electoral system, stupid. We have a broken electoral system. When Levin gave that speech, we were after 5 elections in 4 years. We are the election, in terms of frequency election, we are the record holders in the OECD. The average term of a justice minister in the last 25 years is 1.4 years. Which justice minister, be he as brilliant as Levin really is, can master an entire bureaucracy, a new domain, and make change in 1.4 years? We are just really suffering from a system that has clearly outlived its usefulness, and we need to restore a sense of stability and also better representation for our citizens. I'll just throw out another statistic. I mean, Israel has grown tenfold since 1948, yet the Knesset has remained the same size. We have the highest ratio of representatives to constituents in the Western world. These are not superhumans. They're members of Knesset. They need help. And that's, I think, where a more productive discussion about good reform can be had, not piling on the one institution, which in the Israeli system is really the only check on the otherwise absolute power of a temporary political majority, which I think is reckless, ill-considered, and not surprisingly has brought out millions to the streets for 22 weeks going. Now, in terms of the the shifting of the guard, the demographic changes, obviously this is a very big question. I think at the heart of it is the question of the ultra-Orthodox and their integration into society, into economy, and the question of ultra-Orthodox military service, which is where I might agree somewhat with Avi. This has been the real hot potato that has been tossed back and forth between the Knesset and the Supreme Court. Obviously raised the ire of the ultra-Orthodox, only 10% of whom serve in the army, and by many who do serve, that is considered profoundly unjust and unsustainable as the ultra-Orthodox grow in number. It also raises, of course, very serious questions about the viability of Israel's miracle economy, the startup nation, a success story. I mean, 10% of the workforce, can it continue to sustain an economy that is increasingly weighed down by a growing population that does not work, pay taxes, and is sort of living off state subsidies in a perpetual PhD thesis, which sounds like a nightmare to me, but I guess for some people it's the way of life that they choose to pursue. So there's no question that is underlying it, and I think particularly the issue of military service, you saw huge turnout and big involvement on the part of military reservists, some of it quite controversial, who are basically saying enough is enough. Why do we serve? Why do we pay taxes and they don't? And this is enabled by a system that they obviously oppose. And this government, of course, with its policies has exacerbated this from their perspective quite significantly. And there's a concern that as the demography changes, Israel will lose both its liberal democratic character and also its economic viability. And that's definitely a part of the story.
Avi, can I ask you, watching the huge protests, and it sounds like you want to make a comment in response to Jesse, but let me ask this question and make the response, then we're going to turn it over to our audience. But my question is this. Clearly, Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to have been, I don't know if the word is chastened, but had his views changed by the extraordinary nature of the protests growing in size. At one point, when Gallant was fired, there were an estimated 700,000 Israelis in the streets that night. That's proportionally the equivalent of 25 million Americans. The largest single-day protest in American history is 5 million. And I want to ask you, leaving aside the merits of the case for judicial reform, does the fact that it was such a neuralgic, that the response of so many Israelis was so neuralgic, heartfelt, and almost revolutionary, did that change your mind about the wisdom of this particular reform at this moment in time, or did it strengthen your views?
Okay, I'm gonna tackle my first what I wanted to say about Jesse, and then I'll get to what you just asked. So Jesse was describing the instability of the Israeli public system, about the frequency in which parliaments fall, new elections, the frequency of which governments fall more frequently than the parliamentary elections, and Jesse describes this as a bug. I see it as a feature. Yeah, I think that you can't look at that and actually think that Israeli parliaments, governments exercise unlimited powers. They don't, and there's a reason why they don't. They don't because there's proportional representation in Israel, which means that no party ever wins a majority. Every government is a coalition, and in every coalition, the minorities and the quacks, the weirdos, are all exercising veto powers. And at any moment, the coalition can fall apart over nonsense. And this means it's very, very, very hard to do far-reaching changes in Israel. That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. If you want to know where the check and balance is, it's that. And the question I think that the anti-reformists have to be answering is, what's the check on the court? The court, as it currently constituted in Israel's jurisdictionary, has no check. It has no balance. It makes up its constitutional rules as it goes, and makes up its role as it goes, and does whatever it likes. And in some cases, to quite horrible results. And if you look at the fight we have, for example, over the ultra-Orthodox, it's not a hot potato that went between Knesset and court. It is an issue that is highly controversial, where the parliament reached a compromise. You may not like it, right? The compromise was that for the most part, the ultra-Orthodox get out of service. You may not like it, but the majority of the public was willing to live with it, even though they didn't actually like it, but for the price of stability, they were willing to have it. The court decided it knew better. And then it struck it down as a matter of regulation and forced the Knesset to enact it as a law, and then struck down the law and the court reenacted it. And you have this endless cycle where the court is trying to impose its superior wisdom on the polity. And that is what results in, I think, mass unrest. You can't do this over time. With the virtue of democracy is not necessarily that it reaches better decisions, but it definitely reaches decisions that have broader support than the juristocracy. And this is, I think, more than anything, what is driving people to the streets. What you have today is a very large group that, as you said, it is a minority that fears that it is a permanent minority. And that is secular Israel-born Ashkenazi Jews, primarily in the center of the country, but all over the country. Secular Ashkenazi Israeli-born Jews. And they're not a majority of the population. They look at the demography and they wonder if they will ever reach a parliamentary majority again, together with other coalition partners. And the court is what gives them permanent authority, even though they don't have a permanent majority. And there's genuine fear. There's no doubt there's genuine fear. I have people come up to me and they explain to me, they're genuinely fearful. That's a different group of people than the ones who are coming up to me and telling me to leave their country or drop dead, or that they wish I were killed. Right? But I understand this. I will also say, and this is something that I should have mentioned earlier. After the essay appeared in Sapir, I actually got a call from a former member of Knesset. I don't think I should mention his name, but he's someone on the left-hand side of the spectrum. And he wanted to tell me how much he enjoyed my essay, the essay that you published. And the reason was that I expressed confidence that the majority of Israel is and will remain liberal. Now, he draws from this the conclusion that we still need to strengthen what he views as the liberal institution in Israel, the juristocracy, and weaken the popularly elected branches, because he fears that the masses are not liberal. But I think that's incorrect. I think that the fear is unfounded. I think that the majority of the public does share basic values. It shares a love of democracy. It shares a love of freedom. I think that the best protection of that freedom is the democracy. And I think that ultimately what, the mass fear is more than anything out of lack of understanding. There's a reason why almost all of these proposals have majority support when they're asked about one by one, and why almost all of these proposals were previously proposed by both sides of the political spectrum.
Okay, I see Jesse shaking his head, but I owe it to our audience to get to their questions. So let's just note that Jesse disputes some of the polling data you cited. This is a question from Charles Jacobs, and I think Jesse's the right person to answer it. The question is this: was Bibi's miscalculation about the severity of the public response A, understandable, B, forgivable, C, unpardonable, or D, rectifiable? Good question.
Or none of the above. None of the above.
You can answer it that way too.
Yeah, I'll pivot on that a little bit. I have to say that first of all, I'm enjoying this debate a great deal, and Avi, maybe we should continue this offline. And again, I think there's something positive about this otherwise, somewhat dangerous crisis that we're in, and that we're having this debate about consequential issues and the separation of powers and the scope of judicial review and et cetera, et cetera. But there is this nagging suspicion that we may be pawns in a different game, that perhaps Avi and I are both useful idiots, if you were, because there is this elephant in the room, and it goes to the questioner's question. Our prime minister is on trial for some very serious charges for which he might ultimately go to jail. He is operating in a colossal conflict of interest, and he is now proposing, or the government under him is proposing, to reform the very system that, again, at the pinnacle, assuming his trial would be appealed one way or the other, would be presided over by justices that under the new system his government or successor government would pick. So there is this sense that behind the curtain is the Wizard of Oz, and is this really a genuine constitutional debate that we're having, or is there something more sinister going on? And I've never met Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I would say, for the record, I think will go down in history as one of the most consequential leaders, not only of Israel but of the Jewish people. Certainly the savviest politician around. But when you speak to people around him, you get the sense of someone who has gotten a little too comfortable in his chair after 15 years in power, suddenly frustrated, A, by the trial, B, by 4 elections in a row that he doesn't secure a majority. Maybe the theory goes he's had enough of pesky judges and legal advisors and checks and balances and so on, and this is really the game that's going on. And so I just can't get rid of that nagging suspicion, which is a very troubling one. Obviously, his decision to launch this after giving, I think, an admirable speech in which he gave 4 very plausible priorities for the new government: blocking Iran from getting the bomb, I'll sign on to that; making peace with Saudi Arabia, I'll sign on to that; reducing the cost of living and reining in soaring crime, all laudable objectives. And then this out of nowhere, this broadside assault on the judiciary, and terribly executed. It's really just a bad solution to the wrong problem, horribly executed, and it's backfired spectacularly. Unfortunately, I think some of the damage can't be undone. For instance, investor confidence in Israel and its stability and the stability of its court system, that may take a while to come back, if ever. And this whole undoing of the social contract, where you begin to see reservists saying we have a contract with a liberal democratic Israel, not with an Israel that is less than that. That could be the very, very serious threat to the integrity of the Israel Defense Forces.
This is now a question for Avi, and it goes directly to, it's directed at you, from Benjamin Barnes. To what extent does Professor Bell think that the opposition to the reforms can be attributed to Levin and Rotman mishandling the processing and trying to ram through the reform package with no effort to create a broad consensus?
Well, this actually relates a little bit to what you were talking about just a moment ago, which was Netanyahu's role in this. And so it's not that Netanyahu sprung these reform proposals in order to express his disapproval of the powers of the judiciary. And I will remind you, by the way, the one Israeli prime minister who expressed it most memorably, the problem of the pesky judges, is not Netanyahu, it's Rabin. During the Oslo days, about in extolling the virtues of his agreement, he said that the Palestinians would be able to make decisions without Bagatz and without B'Tselem, that is, without these critical NGOs and without the High Court of Justice, which he found to be intolerably interfering with policy. But what happened with Netanyahu is actually the Attorney General ordered him not to have anything to do with the issue, and it wasn't until the firing of Gallant and the hundreds of thousands turning out in the street that Netanyahu announced that he wasn't going to be following that instruction anymore, and he was going to get involved. And Netanyahu was a different kind of political operator than Rothman, who's a former student of mine, and Levin. He's been around a long time. He's very good at delaying decisions. And he's very good, as his both supporters and opponents say, he zigzags, right? He tries not to make his final target clear until the last moment. He leaves himself that way, maximum maneuverability. So I don't think that Levin and Rothman introduced something to do intolerably quickly or without sufficient explanation. I think that they're simply not as good at Netanyahu as maneuvering. And what we're seeing now is a pretty classic Netanyahu way of managing the policy, which is letting everyone underneath him battle it out, trying to work out deals. Oftentimes, by the way, getting to three-quarter deals to see where the red lines are of every side. We'll see where this ultimately goes. There's one person who knows, and it's not me.
Nathan Lewin wants ask a question of you, Jesse. He asks, isn't it true that Aaron Barak rejected the self-imposed limitations that the US Supreme Court has consistently accepted, such as the non-justiciability of political questions and the requirement that a complaining plaintiff have personal standing to initiate a legal challenge to some governmental decision?
You're asking a historian a highly dense legal question. Avi, why don't you? I cede the floor. Shoot away.
Yeah, so this was actually one of the most controversial decisions of Barak. In 1986, Barak decided to get rid of standing requirements, that is, to allow any person to bring any dispute into court, notwithstanding the fact that they had no personal stake in it. He did it, by the way, on a question of whether the ultra-Orthodox should be drafted. And the result of this is that the court is involved in every political decision. So it's not only that Barak changed the rules about the kinds of decisions that the court will make, policy instead of law, right? It's also that he created the ability of the court to set its agenda. Every policy question ends up in the court. And so the court can use its magic bag of tricks on everything. And yes, this is a completely unrestrained judiciary for that reason. And it's one of the reasons, again, why I think that judicial reform is so absolutely necessary.
Just a quick follow-up to that, Bret, if I may. Just to say, I mean, I also really sympathize with what Avi describes he's going through on a personal level, and I think it's important that people are personally targeted for their views and expressing them as experts. I would want to say, I'm just picking up on this last comment, that what is being done to Aaron Barak in the Court of Public Opinion in Israel, including death threats. This is an 87-year-old Holocaust survivor who's been out of the Supreme Court for 20 years. Demonstrations, loud demonstrations outside his house, calling for him to be put to jail for treason and worse is really abominable. So we can have this debate about Barak's legacy. Did he overreach? Did he not overreach? To what extent the legacy lives on? But I think targeting him personally, one of the towering giants of Israeli jurisprudence is beyond the pale.
Stanley Spatz asks a question that I'm going to modify somewhat. He says, it seems the overwhelming majority of Israelis favor a middle ground compromise. He asks, why can't we get there? Let me ask that in an affirmative sense. Can we get there? Avi?
Well, it depends who the middle ground is, because there's between juristocracy and parliamentary democracy, there isn't all that much compromise room. It's it's zero sum in some sense, and so the people who like some form of judicial reform are not likely to reach a compromise with those who don't like any form of judicial reform. And I'll add that because the protests against the government have been so potent, and they're mixed up in the public mind with everything else, with this identity politics, it would not be a wise idea for those who are, the center left to compromise on this, because they're getting much farther by being a resistance rather than political opponents. That said, if you could get the 70% or so that actually likes some kind of reform, I think that there's eminent room to bargain to a resolution. the problem here is not it's not one of negotiation workshops figuring out where the middle ground is. The problem is the political motivations on the left are no compromise, and until something changes in that, I don't see that. I don't think that it's impossible, but we're not there yet. Until that changes, we're not going to reach a compromise. Once that does change, if it changes, then I think that a compromise can be hammered out in 2 days. And what it'll look like, I don't really know, because there's so many different pieces to this, but it would involve some form of cutting back on Barak's court's doctrines, and some sort of change in the appointment system so that the court is less hyper activist and less involved in controlling public policy. How it'll look, I don't know.
Jesse, can we get to a
Sure. Since Avi, this is, I think, the second time that you've characterized the opponents as of the left, and I'll do something that's probably unwise and out myself as an old-fashioned conservative and say that my opposition to this is because I don't trust Yariv Levin, I don't trust Yair Lapid, I don't trust Bibi Netanyahu, I don't trust any of them with my liberty. And I want those rights entrenched in a Bill of Rights that know that only a supermajority can change. That's just sort of my perspective on things. In terms of the polling, here's where I get to respond to Avi's characterization of public opinion on this. So yes, I mean, 70% support dialogue and some sort of compromise. Now that's sort of broad. Only 21%, this is according to polls that we did at the end of April, support passage of the reform as is without a broad compromise. And when you break it down into the components of the bill, obviously, in general, supporters of the coalition are more apt to support the package as a whole. Opponents of the coalition are apt to oppose it. But only 24% of the broad public supports parliamentary override as proposed now with a majority of 61. Only 28 support giving the coalition control over the judicial appointment process. But again, to end on the positive note, 2/3 of the public support constitutional arrangement based on the Declaration of Independence. So I think that's where we should pivot from this terrible crisis to an opportunity to bring Israelis together, secure our rights, define the relations among the three branches of government, and ride off into the horizon.
So I'm almost heartbroken to have to bring this conversation to a close and stick to real time, not Jewish time, and allow it to go on for a long time. Two of the smartest people I know, and two of the best people I know, Avi and Jesse, I think you just provided a master class in how to disagree agreeably and intelligently, and how to really advance a discussion by providing a lot of light, a lot of eloquence and entertainment, but not heat and rancor. So I'm just absolutely delighted that I was able to bring the two of you together in a virtual room. And I hope you take up, I forgot whose suggestion it was, to have this exact conversation offline and in other fora, because there's no conversation that is more important right now in Israel than this one, and I can't think of two more intelligent interlocutors to do it publicly. I want to thank you both. I want to thank you for your magnificent essays in our 9th issue on Israel in 75. And I particularly want to thank our wonderful and engaged audience, really some of the smartest, sharpest people around who are interested in what we at the Maimonides Fund are interested in, which is offering ideas, even if they're contrasting or clashing ideas for a thriving Jewish future. So thank you both, and enjoy the rest of your days.